This is the WGBH Forum Network.
The Creative Method. The National Association of Educational Broadcasters presents Gyorgy Kepes on design. Here first is Lyman Bryson.
Some observers of the work of a designer have wondered how you can be creative if what you do is to spend your time solving the problems of other people. In the first place, the work of a designer solves the problems that arise external to himself, of course, but they may come from a very wide variety of fields and present an astonishing range of problems. And the work of a designer is not so limited as this suggests. In his conversation with Bill Kavnes, Mr. Kepes indicates how much broader and wider the work of a designer may be.
I assume it would be very difficult to make a crisp, clean definition, but one may refer to one essential difference between what we call fine arts and what we call design. In fine arts, the main motivation, the main stimulation, and the major decision to do or not to do a work is coming from the man himself who is doing the work. In case of a designer, though he has a kind of inner tension and needs to express himself, he has to have an outside task, and he wraps his ideas, he focuses his knowledge toward this given task coming from the outside.
Can we become a little more specific on things that are included within the field of design? Some of your work has been architectural in nature, has it not?
Yes, I, like most of the so-called designers, are working almost the total band of spectrum of design tasks. Actually, that's the exciting part of it. And my own work includes exhibition designs, graphic designs, working with architects, making architecture murals, designing films, and so on.
You're listening to Gyorgy Kepes on design. The Creative Method. The designer as creator. One of 10 conversations with creative Americans about the nature of their work. The Creative Method, prepared by WGBH FM in Boston under a grant from the National Educational Television and Radio Center. Later, we'll tell you how you may obtain excerpts from this and 21 other radio essays on the creative process in American arts, sciences, and professions. But now, Gyorgy Kepes on design. And here is Bill Kavnes.
How does a designer get his ideas, his conceptions? What are the things that stimulate you to creative thinking in the field of design?
I assume it would be a little dangerous to generalize. What I could do the best just to report how I could observe myself in the design process. The first thing that happens that one has a kind of hatching period. You have a task and you don't have any clear, defined idea how to proceed, but you try to scan your own resources. And there are two types of resources. One of one's responses to the outside world in terms of a quality of an experience. What appeals to me, what doesn't appeal to me, what color combination, shape combination, rhythmical combination of line makes sense, where I respond with a certain delight or a certain intensity. And that's somehow one territory, but I have to go back in myself and try to pick up some relevant quality, but I feel it may have some use in this particular task. The other is the knowledge, what one gathered from the outside world. As every design task is a very concrete task in terms of function and structure, I have to collect again from my memory resources whatever relevant knowledge I have about this particular type of function or this particular type of structure which could be utilized. And there are somehow, generally speaking, the two major territories what one has to survey before one gets to the idea. But how the idea comes, I assume, is at least for the time being, is a certain mystery, but we just always hope it faces us, but we never can really force it to come to speak to us.
Well, it's a metaphysical thing, then.
It's not a metaphysical. It is some process more complex than one could really define in a clear analytical way.
But then, of course, the idea could never arrive without this background of experience and the artistic stimulus. You've done a great deal of painting, haven't you?
Yes.
As a matter of fact, have done as much work in the field of painting as you have in design, as I understand it.
It's a kind of off and on process. I began as a painter, and for different psychological, social reasons, I gave up painting. I felt it's not a dynamic and meaningful enough media to act effectively in a 20th century dynamic world. And I became very much interested in tools and mediums where I felt that one can use them in a more effective, more direct way. But in the last 8 or 10 years, I discovered that to act really with all the resources one has to know these resources, and painting is one way of digging into oneself and discover oneself. And actually, year by year, I got more and more passionately involved in painting, and at least as far as I can judge myself, my work as a painter has a very strong influence on my work as a designer.
Not only in the color sense involved, but the compositional sense as well?
Maybe broader than that. It gives, at least for me, a certain inner security that I can face a task more courageously because I feel I am one and not just kind of giving in to one or the other minor assignments. Maybe I would put in another way, I'm more interested in the expressive aspect of design and not the technical kind of inventive aspect of it. Again, if I could give an example, some years ago the Life magazine asked my wife and me to design a room for our daughter, what they published later. And this included literally everything in the room, furniture, light, murals, everything. And maybe it's interesting just to see or recall my own thinking process in facing this task.
Yes.
What we tried to do to live into the spirit or the scale of interest of our daughter, who was in this time 5 years old. And we really had to observe her maybe more intensely than parents usually observe, because we want to give her the optimum chance to have a space where really she could realize herself in her particular stage of development. We observed, for instance, that when we took her for a walk, she had a particular tree in Longfellow Park, but she just loved to climb because it was just not too big and not too small. The small was disgraceful because it was no challenge. Too big, it was just too difficult. So what we did, we searched for and found an actual tree which somehow had the same characteristic of intricate quality and exactly the scale what she could handle, and we chopped it and we put it in the room, and it was a climbing tree in the room. Then we observed that she has, like some of the children, some difficulty to take farewell from the day. That when we turned out the light, it was almost a traumatic experience. She didn't want to kind of get away from all the excitement of the day. So we had to have, or we tried to create a buffer state between day and night, and we put on the ceiling a kind of intricate star system and painted with phosphorescent light, which was activated with the actual light, and when we turned out the light, the whole ceiling started to glow, and this glow was not a steady glow, but gradually it faded out. So it was not a sudden shock, but it was a transition. Then we observe how she enjoys just to run around barefooted, particularly in the wet grass and so on. And we try to give her every morning some chance to feel that her feet has also an experience of richness. And we made a carpet, which was something what one call a collage, a combination of different furs with different softness or roughness, and she just loved to run around and to feel this whole kind of keyboard of sensibilities. But I'm mentioning with it that my main interest in design, not the technical, not what I sometimes call maybe in a mean way a technical fetishism, not to explore the new technological potentials, but to see how can we apply what we have today to satisfy human needs. So my main interest is actually to read these human needs and try to apply whatever I know to give the optimum solution for it.
The creative method that you bring to bear in this kind of work, does this with you differ in each case? The approach to each design task is dictated by the task?
I assume there is maybe a constant core of one's own attitude to the world which feeds all solutions, but naturally each concrete task has its unique conditions, and one has to read and explore these conditions. So the method changes.
Would you say that since the field of design has such a tremendously wide range of applications that it calls up, requires of you greater creative activity than a more restricted art would, than painting, for example?
Again, I think it is extremely dangerous to make any commitment, but if I would dare, I would say in painting or in the so-called fine arts, one faces deeper layers of one creativity than in a form of what you mentioned as an applied art or applied design, where part of the task was actually parceled out for you before you had any thought about it. Maybe one puts in this way that design as a field has a broader horizon in a horizontal sense, but artistic expression in painting or in sculpture or what we call fine art has a deeper horizon within, that it sees within more intricate and more extended relationships than one could ever touch in an applied design form.
Would it be accurate to say that in painting you stand much more of a chance of becoming yourself emotionally involved with the artistic expression than in design?
Yes, very definitely. Not that one really achieves this oneness with oneself, but the aim is to get closer, to be authentic, to be oneself. And in the design, it's actually more a bridge between you and the outside world, other people, or the physical environment.
Do you find that your own activities are stimulated by the receipt of a commission, or do you find that the commission is a restricting thing?
I think, generally speaking, it's an inspiring aspect of it, because the so-called client, whether it's a client of an architect or a client of a book design or a client for an exhibition design, has a certain image, a vague image of what he wants. A person who wants to have an architect to design his house has some vague knowledge what type of life he wants to live and what type of environment he wants to have this life. But he has neither the tools of knowledge nor actually the ability of visualization. And then it's an exciting task to read the mind of this man and try to, without sacrificing one's own standards, to give the optimum solution for this clearly defined outside task. And basically in all other design commission, one has this vague notion about what the other man expects from you. The great danger is when some of the clients, for some reason or other, assume more knowledge about this particular task than they should. for instance, we very rarely interfere with our doctor telling them how we want to have our operation or something like that. But it happens very frequently that the client who sets the task will also want to solve the task. And then there are complications, and the creative joy is partly gone. I'm just in the process of completing a big mosaic wall in the Sheraton Hotel in Dallas. And it may give again certain spotlight of the issues involved. Every design lives also in a physical space. If you have a book cover, which is book jacket, which is never put in a shop window, then it didn't have its chance. You could do the best job, it didn't do its job. The same way one could create a mural or any type of architecture work, and if it has no good chance to be seen, then one is inhibited from the very beginning or handicapped from the very beginning. In this particular task, I had a wonderful chance because a very large mosaic mural, maybe 30 feet by 13 feet, and it is on the end of a 120 feet corridor, and there's no interruption, that just a very chance to really to be in focus with the work gives an extra joy to do it well. It has no major significance, but it puts some spotlight or puts some light on the issues involved. I had one task a couple of years ago, also in Dallas. It was a Jewish temple, and I was working with Worcester, the former dean from the School of Architecture, who was a designer with some Texan architect of the temple. And I was in charge of the total orchestration of the temple in terms of color, light, and every type of artistic or decorative work. I couldn't do, or I didn't do all the work myself. I commissioned myself some of the work to some friends or designers. I had great confidence in it, but it was one of the really exciting tasks because there the total space was controlled, so every color, every light effect, every texture was correlated, and it was really the task of a conductor to create an atmosphere, a religious atmosphere, which really lives up to the expectation.
It's a fascinating use of parallel terms. You say you were orchestrating the whole design of the temple. Did you work directly with the architects as well as with the other designers? And you were in on this from the beginning of the
I was
planning.
on it from the beginning, on all the building committee meetings, so I had the chance to follow up every little conflict or joys from the beginning to the bitter end, and it was very helpful because I could see all the tasks not just in a narrow but in its broadest context.
There are several other questions I'd like to touch upon before our time runs out. One of them is this. You, as we have said, are active as a painter as well as designer. Are most design specialists also active in other art fields?
I wouldn't say most, but quite a few of them. There are designers, they love to paint, but they don't consider themselves kind of equal as a designer and as a painter. In my own case, at least I always hope that I'm stronger painter than I'm a designer.
Some of them, though, will take up activity in another art more as a hobby, as a relaxation.
It's a kind of refreshing river, just to take a nice cold bath and to be again fresh and happy.
But then a good many of these people would tend, in their major effort, to specialize, to restrict themselves.
Yes.
Is that helpful in bringing forth the creative stimulus, to have these boundaries?
I personally think it's not very healthy. It's somehow in the general groove of our mass production civilization and almost inevitable, but it always kind of sacrifices more than gains.
How would a person go about preparing himself for a career in the field of design? Are there schools that teach the necessary skills?
There are schools, and I may stick my neck out, I think...
Well, of course, you yourself are professor of visual design at MIT.
A very large part of what we call design education really doesn't go to the real issue, because they try to do a vocational training. And as far as I understand the issue, the most important is really to develop sensibilities, faculties, imagination. And so the real training is to develop a different type of man who is able to see and enjoy what he's seeing. And actually it's very dangerous to give an education where you don't promise that you give the tools to make you living. But I think in the long run, at least in the beginning of design education, such type of very broad preparation of the humus would be much more important than just creating very clearly defined vocational tools and then passing them out, which may be used, but it will be the very end of their own creative career, because they cannot grow from further, only they just stick.
If you have only the tools...
If they have only the tools, they're not the men who could really use flexible the tool, then it's not a very promising future. We cannot harvest before we have a humus, which is a real rich humus, and we have the seed. And if we try to do it just too early, it will be just not what we expected to have. And I think vocational training, without preparing this deeper humus and without choosing the real seed, just never will give the real harvest.
Well, vocational training only then just simply couldn't grow, wouldn't it?
No, it couldn't grow.
Have the possibility of growing. Could we expand just a bit on the steps, the process involved in the creative method of design? You've said that this is a combination of experience plus outside knowledge. How do you go about applying these various aspects of the preparation that you need for executing a piece of design work?
In terms of experience of the qualities of a visual joy, I think the best way of doing it to walk around with open eyes and look at both nature forms, nature textures, nature lines, and also the great heritage what we have from age-old times in visual arts. And being able to see all this wealth of visual qualities, we may develop our own personality, our own preferences. Everybody wants to see one aspect of the world. We cannot see everything at the same time. And I think the greatest possible range of experiences give you the chance to bring together those aspects of visual qualities which has definite relevance to your own needs.
Well, that leads us into the other major step in the creative method of the designer then, and that is the acquiring of the outside knowledge of the specific task that must come before you can execute the task. How do you go about learning the necessary outside things in an aspect of design that perhaps you haven't touched upon before?
It has, again, a very wide range of possibilities. One, and I would emphasize the very strongest aspect of it, to be very open-minded to the changing knowledge about the world around us. Today, in this extremely dynamic, scientific, explosive world, we have literally daily new and new insight into nature structures, in nature configuration, in nature processes. And a designer who still looks just to the past knowledge will not have the ability to imagine new combination without actually mobilizing the new knowledge as well. So I think it's extremely important for every designer who expects from himself something to face this new reality, the new conceptual knowledge, the new visual knowledge about the world. Not how he feels about it, what he knows about it. And I feel very strongly that these two aspects are necessary and complementary. One has to have this very broad panorama of the wealth of visual richness, and from these bells gradually crystallize one's own physiognomy of preferences. At the same time, one has to have a very broad perspective of the most advanced knowledge about the physical world, again, for the reason that he's able to filter out and select relevant knowledge which could be pinpointed to some of these his own creative tasks. I feel very strongly that to express a 20th century experience, one has to be a 20th century man, and a painter, a sculptor, who doesn't see his world, cannot express the feelings about this world. And you may know that fairly recently, 2 years ago, I published a book, The New Landscape in Art and Science, which had as a basic central theme the conviction that to live up to a true creative task in 20th century, we have to have our eyes open to all phases of 20th century life.
Gyorgy Kepes on design. And here again is our host and commentator for the creative method, Lyman Bryson.
I think you might have been struck with the fact that Mr. Kepes spoke of his work as a designer as the solution of problems. These are not quite the terms that most artists use in talking about their work. And yet the designer has this very complicated task of trying to solve a problem which arises external to himself, and at the same time to express himself in the design which he produces. And this, of course, gives his whole operation a kind of central problematic aspect. He has to express himself, but he has to do what the other man needs to have done. Now, where does one turn for this? One's inspiration, of course, can't always be counted on. It's an illusory benefit at best. Well, Mr. Kepes says one has one's own responses to one's own experience. And he has been able to see how other men have solved similar problems, and without copying what they have done, he can get hints as to how basic principles can be put to work. And above all, and this I think needs to be emphasized, above all, turn to nature. It's interesting that all of the people who talk about all the aspects of creativity that we have discussed in this series have said sooner or later something about turning to nature, or turning to one's own experience, turning directly to those things which one has found out for oneself and which are in the real world, the physical world perhaps, the political and social world, to be somebody of your own time, and at this same time to be intensely and sincerely yourself. Seems to be a basic principle with all these artists, which controls the operation of a designer just as it controls those who work in the theater, in architecture, in music, or in literature. And on one of the newest and most popular arts, motion pictures. Next week we will hear from a famous producer, Mr. Dory Sherry.
Thank you, Dr. Bryson. You've heard Gyorgy Kepes, the designer as creator. One of 10 conversations furthering our understanding of creativeness in American arts and professions. The creative method is recorded by WGBH FM in Boston under a grant from the National Educational Television and Radio Center. Producer, Jack D. Summerfield, with Lorland Thatcher and Bill Cavness as production associates.
This is the National Educational Radio Network.